All right, let's bring in now the Herald Sun's business commentator, Terry McCrann, and economist, Chris Richardson. Welcome to you both. So great to see you. Chris, gosh, you've had the busiest 24 hours probably after the Treasurer, 1,000 interviews. And Terry, you've written some sensational pieces as well on the budget. I don't know if you both heard the interview I just had before with Andrew Charlton. He was strongly mounting the case that this budget isn't inflationary. Chris Richardson, he said that you were wrong to make the claim that it could add to inflation and could lead to rate rises. Do you want to respond to that? Why do you think this could add to inflation in Australia?
And let's be clear, Andrew is a great economist, and I hope he's right and I'm wrong. You don't want it to add to inflation, and you don't want it to bring the Reserve Bank back off the bench. But the bulk of professional opinion, and to be fair, it is divided, but the bulk of professional opinion among market economists and academic economists is it does do it. The government had two tasks with the budget. It did need to spend to protect the most vulnerable. Things like JobKeeper, I've been a long-time supporter of increases there that needed to be done. But you also, you know, as you do that and as you put money into the economy with those spending decisions, you need to take it back out because extra money in the economy gets spent. That extra demand drives extra inflation, and that is the risk that there is enough extra money going into people's pockets off the back of this budget that it will drive extra inflation and worry the Reserve Bank enough.
Yeah, that it could act as a stimulus and they might spend the money on other things. I mean, that $500 one-off payment for energy relief, that's only going to people who already are getting some assistance for energy. But if they then spend it on consumer goods, that would act as a stimulatory effect. What do you think of this question, Terry McCrann?
Confession time, Sharri. I have to go with the two docs, Dr. Andy and Dr. Jim. I disagree fundamentally with Chris on this, that it's not inflationary. We don't have a demand-driven inflation problem. The inflation pressures are all coming from the supply side, and they have been going back to the Ukrainian invasion. And a little bit before that as well.
Well, and the COVID pandemic response as well. That affected the supply chains.
Exactly, all that. But $13 billion has been injected by the policy decisions in 2023, 2024 in a $2.5 trillion economy. It's not that significant. And as I say, we don't have a demand-driven inflation problem. So putting this extra money into the economy is not going to make a significant difference. The problem threat on inflation is wages and productivity. And if this can provide some incentive for unions to accept lower wage increase, I think it's actually a positive on that front. So I don't see this as a serious threat to inflation, and I certainly don't see the Reserve Bank reacting by raising interest rates. They may well raise interest rates. They may well raise interest rates again in June, but it will have nothing to do with the budget.
Well, and that's the thing, Chris, if and when the RBA does raise interest rates, because it has indicated that we are looking at more rate rises this year. I can't even imagine a scenario where we get through the second half of this year with no rate rises. But when the RBA does this, inflation is now a political football, and Peter Dutton and the opposition will blame the government for it, whether or not the budget has had an inflationary impact.
And I absolutely see that point. Also see Terry's point, and I would agree that the bulk of the inflation in Australia is driven by a lack of supply. You know, the war over in Ukraine, the earlier floods here in Australia, the mess of COVID policies and supply chains coming out of China. Absolutely true. But what matters for inflation is the net of demand and supply. And it is still the case, even if demand is not the bulk of the problem, you add extra money, you have extra inflation risk. To your point, Sharri,
yes.
Absolutely true. We will never know for sure what the Reserve Bank does and doesn't do in terms of the specific drivers. And if it's government policy, you can be sure that the Reserve Bank will never say that because they try to keep clear of politics. I was, after the Reserve Bank's last rate rise, hopeful they were done and dusted. off the back of this budget, I am now less clear that's true.
Terry, you absolutely smashed Jim Chalmers in your piece today on his budget. You've said the surplus is all part of a smoke and mirrors plan to carve out a legacy for Jim Chalmers, for himself as a treasurer who delivered a surplus. Why have you been so critical about this budget?
Well, the fundamental factor, Sharri, I mean, you've got deficit for the last 10 years. You suddenly have this big big jump to a very tiny surplus, and then we immediately go back to deficit, as projected by Treasury, all the way through to 2033, 34. So, I mean, that in itself tells you there's something rather unusual about this. Why do we get this one surplus in the sea of deficits? And clearly, I mean, I think if you go back to October last year, Jim Chalmers had no idea that he'd be getting to the surplus at this point in time, because that flood of revenue that came in that you've identified really built up in the last 6 months. But it's not a foundation. I mean, normally when we think about treasurers claiming I've got the budget back to surplus or near surplus, it's the start of a whole series of surpluses thereafter. But the reality is, and I mean, with putting aside what I was saying about the direct impact on inflation of the spending, the government has locked in huge spending going forward. Even if some of these programs end in the 4-year time frame, they're going to have to be replenished.
Yes.
You can't suddenly stop things like that energy offset.
Yeah. Okay.
So this builds in spending, and it's relying on such huge revenues.
Yeah. All right. I want to just ask Chris Richardson before we're out of time. Bracket creep, fiscal drag, major issues. We're paying, record taxes at the moment, personal income taxes. Does the tax threshold shift that comes with the stage 3 tax cuts, does this do enough to offset, and we're putting the inflation question to one side for a second, but does this do enough to offset that bracket creep? Or, are people just going to be hit and paying more and more tax for years to come? And do you think it should be indexed? Do you think the tax thresholds should be indexed to inflation like other countries do?
There is a good case for indexation. There's a good case for stage 3, and stage 3 is not unfair or not nearly as unfair as it's often portrayed. The problem, I would say, is that the cost of running Australia has gone up. We've already mentioned Vladimir Putin in this discussion. Important countries are run by crazy people. Wars, are more likely. The world is more dangerous. We need to spend more on defence. And it turns out we haven't been spending enough on, ignore NDIS, where there are specific issues, but a range of other social services we were underfunding. The cost of Australia's gone up. We have to help fill that gap over time. I wouldn't rule out trimming the stage 3 tax cuts, not because they're unfair, but because the cost of running Australia's gone up. All
right. Chris Richardson and Terry McCrann, been such a delight to speak to you both today. Thank you very much for your time.